Welcome to the Why Music podcast, where we talk to independent artists about their journeys, the inspirations behind their music, and ultimately why they make music. This next artist is a New York City-based singer-songwriter who teamed up with a Grammy-winning producer to release his first album. Taking inspiration from some of the songwriting greats, his music is timeless while still holding its ground in the modern music landscape. Welcome, Ilan.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, thanks for being here. I always like to start with where your music journey kind of all started.
Yeah, sure. I was always as a kid just I had the bug. Um, I picked up all kinds of instruments, started with the flute, then saxophone, then kind of wanted to sing, which is tricky to do with the flute or saxophone. So I picked up a guitar, then moved to piano. This has been going on my whole life. Um, but it wasn't until maybe 5 or so years ago that I really decided to go for it and make music my career, do it professionally. And I went to Berkeley for my master's, and um, I just started writing and producing mostly for other people. That's kind of how I cut my teeth. And then the artist project came along fairly recently, about a year ago. So that's when I started releasing music. Um, yeah, that about sums it up.
Um, when did you kind of decide to start like writing and producing and doing all that even for other people? It's interesting because it's usually it starts by doing it for yourself and then you're like, okay, I can do this like for other people, or you just stick with that route. So what kind of made you take it in that direction to start and then ultimately decide to do an artist project?
Um, I mean, yeah, you're right. It usually kind of goes the other way. I think I was really, like just behind the scenes. I felt more comfortable behind the scenes. And so I have a studio which you're in virtually. And so people would come by and I just felt more comfortable writing and producing for them than being the artist myself. But then it kind of got to the point where I was writing a lot of songs that I didn't necessarily think fit for a lot of artists. A lot of artists that I produce and write for lean more towards the pop direction, and these are definitely more singer-songwriter, indie. And when you write in that way, it's the whole point of singer-songwriter is that you sing your own songs, and so at that point I was like, well, let's see how that goes. And then I started recording those, and they started sounding pretty good, and I got a good response from people, and so I just kind of went for it, and it was definitely an adjustment because again, I like to be behind the scenes. I'm not a super public person. But once I put him out, the response was pretty good, and then I kept going.
Yeah, that's interesting that it just kind of happened almost unintentionally because you were writing stuff that just didn't fit the bill of everything else. But I'm sure a happy accident considering it's turned into your whole own thing and you already have however much experience under your belt doing this for other people. You kind of are starting with a little bit of a foundation instead of starting just completely blank slate.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think one of the obstacles for, or initial obstacles for being an artist was that I couldn't produce, and so I couldn't, even if I wrote songs on a guitar or piano, I didn't know how to turn them into records. And so once I got that skill through collaborating a lot, in Berkeley, and then sort of in the city with artists in the city, um, my own artist project and sound kind of made more sense to me. Um, so so yeah, that's why the order of operations kind of started with writing and producing for other people. And once I had that skill developed, my own sound kind of just started coming out of that.
Yeah, That's really cool, especially because it's like a little bit of a branch off from the other things. It's like not as it's not a debate on whether this is going to be for me or this is going to be for somebody else. It kind of comes from this place of like it has to just fit in one of those areas. It's not a coin toss or anything like that. And I'm sure to watch your own sound kind of develop has been a really cool experience.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think all artists kind of have to write and sort of develop, over years. You write hundreds of songs that you'll never put out. But at least for me, there was definitely a turning point. There was sort of one song, which was the first one I put out. It's called Through It All. And that one just really felt different. There was something about it where I was like, this feels releasable. This feels professional. And for years, I didn't feel like most of my songs were. And once that happens, it's a little scary because then you're like, oh, can I do that again? Um, but after the first one, it gets a little easier actually. And so then, once I felt like I'd crossed that, that level or the Rubicon, I was like, okay, then let's keep this going. Let's start putting out songs and stop sort of making excuses, and one of the hardest parts about it has been kind of being a little bit more public, doing things like this. But thank you again for having me. Um, because again, I'd rather kind of support other artists, or at least before I really it's all I did. Because once you are the artist, there's so much more than just the songs. Starting from performing and then having to have sort of a presence online and doing interviews, and so there's a lot of kind of being the face and the voice of your own, the captain of your own ship that I wasn't used to at all. But I feel like I'm kind of getting the hang of it.
Yeah, I mean, at some point it just becomes the thing. It's just, you kind of dip your toes in and then you jump off the high dive at some point, you work your way up. Um, but for your artist project specifically, what do you find most often inspires your songwriting?
I It's definitely the lyrics for me. Talk about order of operations. I think most people start with the music when they write a song, and that's kind of really inspiring. There's a spark there, and then they'll kind of put words to that melody. For me, like if I don't have lyrics, almost in like poem form, I really almost can't write. It never happens for me the other way around. And I think some of my influences, Dylan, Springsteen, Leonard Cohen, those guys kind of operate in the same way. And so I listened to all their catalog and, so I used to just write. I used to write a lot of lyrics, poems, essays, and those kind of just sang to me. If the words were there, everything else was easy. Um, and I've tried the other way around. It just doesn't work for me.
That's interesting. Yeah, I definitely it's it's either music first or it's like hand in hand kind of walking the same line. Um so do you end up then like writing like the full thing pretty much word by word and then bringing in the music?
Yeah, pretty much. I used to write in a notebook, the old fashioned way, but then I would have these ideas everywhere I was going. And, so I started doing it on my phone. And sometimes, yeah, it was little snippets, maybe a title or a first line. Um, but over the next few weeks or sometimes months, I would try to write out the whole thing. But if I had the majority of it, then yeah, maybe I could sit at a piano and start from there. But most of the time, yeah, it's a full song before I even start at the piano. It's almost like what Elton John used to do, and he had Bernie Taupin and his lyricist write the lyrics, and then once those were done, he could just sit at the piano and do his thing. Um, I guess in this case, I'm kind of playing both roles, but yeah, I have to start there most of the time.
Do you, when you're writing the lyrics themselves, do you write the melodies then as well, or does that not come in until there's an instrument involved?
Yeah, it doesn't sing, it's like, and sometimes that's a little scary because yeah, they're just words. It almost doesn't have to do anything with music. Might as well just be poetry or a poem. Um, and then I sit at the piano and then something makes sense. Most of the time it's the piano. Every so often I gravitate towards guitar. Piano is just a little bit more melodic in my opinion. Guitar, there's just kind of more harmony, more chords. Piano, there's you can trace out the melody. It's kind of easier to play. Um, Kind of just a little melody, line. So yeah, that's how it happens.
Interesting. I kind of want to try that now because I've never done I'm a musician before I'm a songwriter. Like I grew up playing piano, um, stuff like that. And so like starting the other way seems scary, but also like really interesting at the same time because who knows what that might unlock. That could be really cool.
I mean, I sort of at some point realized that if I started with the music, the piano would be so fun, but also just really distracting. You could noodle around for hours and it almost gets in the way of the song. So I felt like, it was like step away from your instrument. So I would spend weeks and months away from the piano before deciding, okay, this is a real song. This is ready to put music to it. But I mean, it's a slower way of writing. Leonard Cohen, famously had notebooks and notebooks of verses for Hallelujah. Um, so it doesn't lend itself well to collaborating because collaborating usually happens in a session and happens in a day. This is so much slower than that. So I mean, sometimes I wish I could just start with the music, but it just doesn't work for me.
I mean, if you can figure out what works, that's
Right.
great because I could ask everybody that I've had on here and be like, "What's your songwriting process?" And you were probably one of the few that would actually have an answer for this is kind of how things go. Because everybody else is like, it's like it just kind of sometimes happens here or it happens there, or I start from this and it turns into that. I definitely don't have a rudimentary process. Like that's as slow as it may be, it's a leg up for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like people get inspiration from trying different things, and like, oh, I've never used this synth to start a song, and ooh, that sound is cool. Or yeah, that title is cool. For me, like, the inspiration comes from sort of that discipline of writing every day and being like, oh, I've never said that in a song. So it all kind of there's variations within the lyrics. I've never written from that point of view, never used that rhyme scheme, and that's what really gets me going.
Yeah, it's really interesting. But definitely worth giving a shot. I will have to probably take a stab at that myself.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely. I
yeah.
recommend it, but just be aware that it is, you know, a process. It takes weeks. It's so frustrating. It's sometimes really almost dry because it's non-musical. It's
Mhm.
literary maybe, but it's not musical. And so I think, I mean, people like Leonard Cohen, they were writers before they were musicians. He had novels, poems. Um, so I've never published as just a writer, um, but maybe at some point that'd be really fun.
Yeah. Um, if you had to create a new genre around your style of music, what would it be called?
Oh boy. Um, I've been playing around with the idea of folk a lot. I think folk traditionally has been, on an acoustic guitar, and a guy and a girl or a girl just kind of putting lyrics to that. Um, I've been really interested in the idea of having that kind of same writing style, but on different instruments. So like synth folk, I would call it sometimes, or electric folk. Sometimes I'll write an acoustic and just play the same pattern on an electric, and it sounds really, really different, which is not necessarily the newest thing because Dylan went electric, right? Um, but it is different. So yeah, maybe synth folk, electric folk, something along those lines, but it would be derived from an existing genre.
Okay. Yeah, it is interesting how the instrumentation can completely like transform the song. But I like the idea of sort of combining two countering elements in that way. It's like you're not going to expect synth like synthesizers and stuff like that to be in folk music, but you're not also going to expect like folk songwriting be turned into that kind of production. So and then and you know, like we said earlier, like experimenting with different ideas is kind of where a lot of cool things can happen.
Yeah, totally. I mean, as a producer, I started to realize, you can write a song on acoustic guitar or just like a poem like I kind of typically do, and then you can produce it like a mariachi song or heavy metal. I mean, really it's kind of like whatever you can do as an artist, wherever your range is, like a song can have, many different identities, and that's why you have all kinds of covers of songs, right? And so if you have a range as an artist and maybe a range as a producer, you can go any which way.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be really interesting to see if you gave like the same set of lyrics to like 20 different artists of all different kinds and no chord progression, no melody. They have no idea what it sounds like. Just see what they do with it and see how many different results you would get. I would really like to see that, is just like, just see what people do.
Yeah, I mean that would be a super interesting experiment. I feel like even just myself, sometimes I will write the lyrics fully and then I'll try one version on piano and it doesn't quite work. Then I'll switch to guitar and then still doesn't work. Maybe it's the melody or the harmony, and I'll just, um, but if the lyrics are strong, it's worth trying a bunch of different kind of musical versions of it. Um, and that's not that hard for me. The lyrics are super hard, but the music takes, usually a day or two at most. So it's easy for me to be like, oh, this version's okay, but sort of you have to kind of really respect the lyrics because they take so long. So you're not going to really get another set of lyrics for weeks or months. So you got to get this one right.
That is interesting. I think also like going back to kind of your writing style, I think at least looking at it from my perspective, um, it probably allows you to really sort of perfect what you're saying and really get clean and cut about whatever it is you're writing, because you don't have the melody guiding it. You don't have the chord progression sort of carving out how it's supposed to look or anything like that. It's like just have to write the words. You just have to tell the story at hand, and that's all you're worried about. Then you can make it into actually what would be a song. Because I think sometimes like approaching it with the music in mind can kind of influence what you're ultimately trying to say and how you say it. But if you focus on just what you're saying first and worry about the music later, you could probably turn out some really cool and impactful stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think the truth is, or at least in my opinion, you can't really have it all. Something has to be first priority, and then second and third priorities. I mean, it's a little easier when you have a big team, and so you have a producer or maybe multiple producers, somebody mixing the song, somebody mastering. If you're doing most of it, you do have to have, you only have a certain amount of bandwidth, and so you have to kind of pick what's going to be the most important thing. And because of my older, sort of more classic folk and rock influences, that's where I decided to go with it. But even there's a handful of writers who still, I think, operate that way. I mean, I've never met him, but if you're familiar with Josh Ritter, he's kind of like a folk star, and his lyrics are just tremendous, and I would imagine that's his first priority. um or Dawes, which is actually a full band, but Taylor Goldsmith is their lead singer and lead songwriter. And so again, his lyrics are so literary. I would imagine those have to come first, or at least they're the biggest priority. So you kind of have to pick, and I think pop tends to prioritize production and the music a little bit more, especially melody. Um, the more indie you lean, the more, you have to kind of pick what's going to be the most important thing. And because of my older, sort of more classic folk and rock influences, that's where I decided to go with it. But even there's a few of the more you put the songwriting maybe a little bit higher on that list. And of course, I'm generalizing, but in my experience as a producer versus being an artist and working in those two genres, you definitely have to pick your lane a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you can't have it all. You're right. You can't do all the things to their like maximum capacity. And even an individual, you could, have a song that's more like the lyrics are stronger than the production. And then a different song you could have be the other way around. Or maybe like the melody's really good on this one, but the words aren't quite there. It could be a combination of a lot of different things. And it could just be how that song came to life and how it was written and what that approach was. And you could be somebody like yourself that is lyrically driven time and time again, or it could be all over the place. Who knows? The options are endless, but yeah, you're right, there has to be something, because you're always going to have some aspect of the song that's like the best part. You're always going to have something that's like of a higher like quality rating, subjective of course, but of a higher quality rating than some of the other parts of it. And we can strive for perfection in all areas as much as we please, but that's when you get to the perfectionist mindset of sitting on that song for 6 months and never putting it out, when you should really just pull the trigger, let a few of them fall a little bit shorter than maybe you wanted them to, but something's gotta bite it a little bit. It's just how it
Yeah,
goes.
perfection is just a trap because obviously it's just not possible, especially because it is subjective. So for some people it might approach perfection, for other people it might be really off base. So I think once you accept that, which for a perfectionist can be really hard, you just get out of your own way a little bit. And there's a saying, done is better than perfect. I feel like done is the only thing that exists. Perfection doesn't. So once you're able to accept that, you're a little easier on yourself, and you start editing after you write, not as you write, which is just it's it doesn't let you be creative. Editing can be a little bit more mechanical. When you're in that flow, in that creative state, if you really try to nitpick, um, you don't let that kind of experimentation happen, which is super important.
Yeah. Yeah, you 100% have to just kind of let it all go, then rework it. Because if you try and rework it as you're going, you might lose the whole point of the story. You might, miss out on what would have been like a really cool line. You just kind of have to word vomit onto the page and then fine tune it. And then you can get there.
Yeah,
But
totally. I
yeah,
mean, I feel like people like Rick Rubin, and other kind of guru creatives talk about sort of being a bit of a channeler. You channel a little bit of energy and that, kind of ineffable thing. And when you're in that state, you got to really take advantage of it because it probably doesn't last that long. And so once you learn to recognize it, sometimes it even happens, on the train or in the shower. You got to find somewhere to write it down and get as much juice out of it as you can. So sometimes I'll just write really, really long songs because I'm really feeling that emotion. And then I go back and be like, okay, you can't have six verses in a song, but you can pick the best and sort of like maybe take a couple lines from this one and like, and so when you're really feeling it, it's that comes first. It might be like 2 in the morning and you're so tired, but you don't know when that's going to come again. So you really have to take advantage of it.
100%. Um, is there a song that you've written that you think best embodies who you are as an artist in terms of like a one song sample, make somebody a fan kind of thing?
Um, well, it's not out yet, but it is a title track of my album. It's called American Love, and I think it kind of encapsulates a lot of who I am. I actually grew up in Mexico, of all places, and I moved to the States when I was 14. And it was very clear to me that the rules of engagement, when it came to romance were really, really different. Um, in Mexico, you kind of grow up in any given state or city, and then you might stay there for life, or maybe move like one state over. I feel like in the States, people are so much more mobile, and so you might not know um your partners as well. I mean, in Mexico, it's probably somebody you grew up with a lot of the time. Um, and so that song, American Love, is really about exploring like how is romance or relationships, how are those different in the States versus Mexico? Um, and it's tricky to navigate in both places. I mean, it's never easy. Um, but um, there's something to be said for either side. I find it a little bit harder to operate in the way that the States does, because I've moved around a lot. I've lived in New York, Connecticut, Colorado for a little bit, and that can be a little disorienting.
Yeah. Interesting to have like a that's not something that I necessarily would have thought of as something that's different from culture to culture in terms of like how those relationships work and then thereafter. But that's really interesting, especially having firsthand experience of the two different sides of the culture. And so taking that perspective into music must be really cool. Um, do you of the things that you have out, is there one that stands out as like if we're talking right now in terms of the one song sample of the existing catalog, is there one that comes to mind for that?
Yeah, I mean, I can go back to through it all.
When the roses all turn blue and the night gets the best of you, through the distance and the change, through the good times and the strange, I'll be there through it all.
I almost wrote that as like wedding vows. I'll be there through it all, and it's really kind of a set of different situations, through the distance and the change, through the good times and the strange, and I really tried to kind of balance it out. The whole idea was like take the good with the bad. um and it's something that I've been trying to learn. I think it all kind of evens out in the end, but if you're going through a low, it feels like that's all you're going to experience. And if you're going through a high, you might forget that a low might be, kind of coming along. And so I think that was really important for me. I wrote it during the pandemic, which obviously was a big low for everybody. And I think it was about keeping perspective. There's always uh, light versus darkness, and you know, happiness, relation, and despair. So I think that's something that I hope I'm able to embody, but we're all kind of working towards it.
Yeah, I think yeah, no, 100%. And I like the kind of message in that. Like, and especially during the pandemic, like that's prime time for that song to be a thing. Like that was the perfect time to write that. Couldn't have been more true. Um, but yeah, that's really cool. Um, if you had to pick two or three artists that you think your music is like a combination of, who would they be?
Hmm. Um, I think I would pick somebody, from the 60s, 70s, and then somebody who's maybe a little bit more contemporary. Um, I think of the three that I listed from the 70s, Springsteen, Dylan, Leonard Cohen. My writing kind of leans more towards Leonard Cohen. It's really kind of succinct, because words take a long time for me. Dylan and Springsteen could just rattle them off. I mean, I really admire that. I would have no idea how to do that. Um, and then somebody more contemporary, maybe like a Phoebe Bridgers. Um, Josh Ritter has been a huge influence. So something along those lines.
Um, as far as I know, you touched on the like songwriting stuff from the older names, but of the more recent ones, what aspect makes you want to pull those names into conversation?
I feel like you can tell they're still lyrically inclined. You know, some of Phoebe Bridgers' lines are just like devastatingly good. Um, but they have surrounded themselves with really, talented and cutting edge producers so that the records don't sound dated at all. They sound like totally something you might have never heard before. So that's why, I always strive for that level. And obviously you reach and never quite achieve, but that's the goal always.
I want to go back to something I mentioned in the introduction, talking about your new album, which we touched on with the American Love being your song of choice. What was the experience like bringing in a Grammy-winning producer to make this record happen? How did that happen in the first place? Like, what was that whole process like, especially bringing in somebody else to do that aspect of the album?
Yeah, I mean, that was amazing. Paul Falcone is the producer you're referencing. I was really lucky, we were in the same circles and he had heard some of my stuff and he'd actually worked with a pretty important influence that I forgot to mention, which is Tom Odell, who's sort of like a modern day piano man, if you know him. And through it all, especially was like just a piano ballad. And so it was a really nice fit, but I won't lie, it was really scary, especially because I wasn't an artist. This was my first album, and I would have never expected for first album to work with somebody of that caliber. And so while we were in the studio, it was a little terrifying because I had to go in there and perform right away. It was my first song. So there's definitely pressure. But Paul was, really supportive and he knew what he was doing. I might not have at that stage, but he knew. So he was really kind of the guide and the mentor through that whole process. But yeah, it was scary but exciting at the same time.
That's really cool. And of course, like to start off on that foot, it's like crazy because, like you said, you don't have any real foundation prior to that, and it's just kind of like I guess we're full sending it the first run of it here. Like that's a lot, but also really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that did prepare me was being in sessions as a writer producer with some really amazing artists. So I wasn't, I was definitely starstruck a little bit, but I'd been in similar situations before, not as an artist. So you learn how to kind of compose yourself and turn those nerves into, something that's a part of the record, and those nerves, those butterflies, they are intrinsically kind of what makes the record emotive, and I think if you're a little too confident, it might almost be off-putting. There's a vulnerability there, that I definitely feel like is in the records. Um, uh, so yeah, I'm proud and happy that happened. At the time, I was like, oh, is this going to come off as nervous? But I think the songs are really sensitive. I'm a very sensitive type. Um, and so it totally helped the identity of the songs.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about how you handle whatever the situation is, whatever kind of feeling you're living in. So channeling that, not challenging that, channeling that into that sort of vulnerability, especially for a singer-songwriter project, is huge. Like that definitely probably made a huge difference in the outcome and the final product.
Yeah, I mean it was really, I guess, raw is the word, and I have a studio. I run and operate a studio here, but we didn't track a lot of the album there or here. It was actually a power station, which used to be a legendary studio and still is, but it's also where Berkeley's campus is in New York. Um, but in that studio, you only get, a few takes, especially if you're doing a bunch of songs at once. And we were doing, we were trying to get five in there. In my studio, I own it. I can do a million takes. But there's pros and cons because then, you're redoing it a million times. And that's currently happening to me. I have 6 songs out. The album's going to be 8. And I have 7 done. So I'm just missing one song. And I've just been definitely not procrastinating, but, just trying, almost overworking it, because you do have that luxury of having as many takes as you want. You can take all the time in the world, but it's kind of the easiest way to get in your head.
That's a really interesting point, because if you're, if you're limited to a certain finite amount, you have to show up and get it in. But it's like if you have your own space to just kind of mess around with it as much as you please, you might. I catch myself doing that plenty of times. It's like I'll do like 6 takes for something one day, then I'm like, no, there's like something that I could have done better, and it'll just keep going, and then it's just this endless process. But if you kind of are on this like time crunch or this limited amount of runs you can do, you just kind of have to show up and do it, and you just have to deliver.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like what they say. I mean, I'm kind of paraphrasing here, but if you want an artist to do his or her best work, just give him a deadline, you know? And it's really hard to impose deadlines on yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And especially I feel like with vocals, you really want to get those right. Um, and I don't know if you're familiar with the process of comping. You've probably done that yourself if you cut your own vocals, but you can piece together different takes, and end up kind of Frankensteining a final take. And it's so easy to get lost in that process, and somebody like Billie Eilish, I think I heard this in an interview. She does like 80 takes, and then pieces together one word, and with like take 1 and then take 79, and just even sorting through that, you can just lose your mind. So comping is a little bit of a blessing and a curse. You can end up with a really polished product, but you can also just end up, spending months on it. So sometimes I like delegating that because I just totally overthink it, and somebody can just be objective and not realize that, okay, and when you said that word, you might not have put as much emotion into it, or the tone wasn't quite right. But it ends up sounding great in the end, because sometimes your perception of a take or a delivery, right? Like the kind of delivery you put on it it's actually just not reflective of how good something is. And that's why it's great to have multiple ears on a project. Um, Sometimes you don't have that luxury as an independent artist, but if you find people who are excited about your work, um, then you are able to kind of just have a bit of a team take a listen. And even though you might be really neurotic about some things, if you kind of find people with a little bit more of like a level-headed approach, then they can kind of help you get to the finish line.
Yeah, sometimes it takes a village for sure. Um, What is an outside passion of yours that you feel impacts who you are as an artist?
I would like to say like another art, but honestly, I think any talent that I do have just went into music. I'm a terrible visual artist. Um, but I love running, which is really hard during the winter. And a lot of my kind of like sparks of inspiration kind of come during a run. Um, and so that's why I use my phone, because you gotta write it as you're on a run. And it's it really kind of calms you. And I can't operate the way of, you're in the studio almost every day, like a 9 to 5. It doesn't really work that way for me. Um, a lot of the songs come unexpectedly, almost out of nowhere. And when you're running, your body and mind are kind of become one. You're more relaxed. And for somebody who's a little bit more like maybe neurotic or on edge all the time, that's one of those times where I'm able to settle down. Um, and you're not putting pressure on the writing. It just kind of comes to you. You're not sitting at a desk trying to get that line. You kind of just let it be a little bit more of a natural process. So yeah, not the arts, but actually, sports. I used to play soccer, but it's kind of difficult to find a league in the city, so I just stick to running. And yeah, that's really shaped my music weirdly.
Oddly enough, you're not the first person who's said running. Um, but I get that. I get that you just kind of there's as much as people hate running a lot of the time, I feel like that's like one of the forms of exercise that gets the most like trash talk to it. Um, it can also be a really like cool experience to just kind of because you like what do you have to do with your what does your mind have to do but wander and think about new ideas and things like that, so you can get really cool things out of that. So it does have its benefit as much as people like to complain about doing it.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be really disciplined with running. Like, there's no way around it. The first few weeks, maybe in months, you're gonna hate it. It's not inherently fun, but the reward is how it makes you feel. And for me, especially in the city, which is so gray, if you can find a little patch of nature, I'm not that close to Central Park, but I do run by the river. That's also a key component. So finding a little bit of nature um in this grid really helps. So maybe it's the running, maybe it's nature, maybe it's both. Um, but once you get over that hump of, "Oh, this is torture and this does not feel good," but you stick with it, it's a little bit addictive because there is all this, this kind of endorphin rush that really, that's like you start to crave it. Um, but yeah, running doesn't have the best rep, especially because sports themselves are just more fun, and you might have a team and it's social. Running is lonesome, but um, you also get to listen to music while you do it. At least I do. So I actually don't listen to that much music anymore because I spend so much of my time creating music. So that's one of the few times where I'm actually just listening to other people, which is nice and not super stressful because it's not my job. Um, it's their job. I just get to be a fan.
True. um no, I think like running is kind of like a metaphor for like any sort of like project that you kind of take on, because it's like, at least for me, as soon as you reach this point of like when you're getting to that point where you're like, okay, like this is not as fun on my body right now, if you can just like push past that little, like you get to that like reaching point, if you can keep going past that, it's almost like things just like get so much easier, and it comes more like you could just like, I feel like if I get past that little bump, I could double my distance and make it as far as I pleased at that point, because it becomes a mental thing at that point. And it's just like anything else where it's like if you're willing to put in just a little bit more effort to get over that hurdle, the other side is so much nicer. It's like I've seen this like picture before, and it was like, it's just like this like cartoon kind of thing, and it's like this guy digging like a tunnel, and it's like whatever, like the like gold or whatever he's looking for is like right on the other side, but there's this like really thin wall of like the dirt or whatever left between him and what he's going for, but he's like giving up because it's like he doesn't know how far he has to go. Still, he just sees the wall that he has to keep on pushing through, but it's really right there on the other side. It's like you don't know how close you are to something until you like get there. And so it's easy to call it quits because it's not in the near horizon, but if you just keep going a little bit farther, it's right there.
Right. And you might think like, oh man, these two are really going off topic. Now it's like a fitness podcast, but actually like it totally relates because it's totally metaphor for songwriting, like when you're starting, it might be really painful. Like, the blank page is really scary. The first few lines might just, they really might not be anything special. But you kind of have to push past that and be really, really disciplined about that. And that's where you end up getting what is special. It might take a few tries. It might take a long time, like for me, in a day, I might get a couple lines, but once you do get that, past that hurdle, like you were saying, the other side is super rewarding. But you have to be willing to go through that. And I think all great art and really life is kind of about overcoming obstacles, which can be torture, or I think it is like if you kind of have a long view, it's kind of beautiful. You don't, nothing real is all that easy. It takes work, relationships, art, fitness, whatever it is. It takes a lot of work often.
I will wrap up our little metaphor segment with this and just say anything worth doing won't come overnight. Point blank period. That's all there is to it.
Yeah.
The next question comes from last week's artist. I started doing, once I hit 60 episodes, I started doing this thing where I have last week's artist essentially write a question for next week's artist. So last week's artist's question was, if you weren't writing music, what would you want to do?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, I kind of touched on this earlier. I think I'd love to be some kind of writer or author or poet, which is again a really impractical career, but I think that's just what inspires me. And if you can push through that, right, of boy, this is so impractical. What are people going to say? Where's the money going to come from? It doesn't happen overnight, most likely years, but you can get there. And congrats on 60 episodes, by the way. That's amazing.
Thank you. Been sticking with it for a good 16 months or so now. It's crazy to think that it's been that long, but happy to still be doing it, and I don't plan on giving it up anytime soon. So yeah. And then what would your question be for the next artist?
Yeah, I mean, this can be maybe a little bit generic, but I think everybody has a really different answer, and the answer can be really interesting. Maybe the question isn't so much, but I think if you've been doing it for a little while, it's kind of logical to ask, what have been some of your takeaways of successes and failures, right? And what would you impart to somebody just starting out? Because I wish I'd gotten all kinds of advice along the way. But I won't answer the question myself. I'll just leave it for the next guy or girl up to that.
I like that. I think that that's a good question to ask, because it's like you like essentially what have you learned from doing whatever it is that you're doing. And you're right, it's like, even though we're all sort of living the same thing in terms of, writing the music, releasing the music, doing all the things and being the artist, everybody's experience is different. Everybody starts from a different square one. Everybody writes songs differently. Clearly, like we were talking about, you're the first person who's come on here and been like, I write the entire song and then the music comes in. It's always interesting to see what different people's experiences are. And, your experience could be very similar to somebody else's, but that could take form in a very different way and prove to be an impact in a different way. Like I could take away a different sort of like life lesson from the same experience that somebody else has, but it's all dependent on where things kind of started, how they've transformed, and that sort of journey along the way.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely are right on the money. Like I'm a bit of a rare breed. I've never met anybody who has a lyrics, like a purely lyrics first process. I know they're out there. I suspect some of the artists that I mentioned do it that way. And so maybe my advice is super niche. But maybe there's somebody out there who does work that way. And so my tips actually were helpful. I hope they were. Because again, I think if you get the right advice, especially when you're sort of just starting out and pre-industry, and you haven't broken into kind of this really clicky world, having somebody guide you through the process of what seems like almost impossible at the time, can really make the whole experience a little bit less daunting. And I mean, it is a career with no one direction, no one path. Like everybody's road is long and winding and looks really different. But there are some commonalities, and takeaways from everybody's journey. So a lot of what I used to do when I was just starting out was read biographies, especially autobiographies of some of my idols. Springsteen's is tremendous. I mean, Born to Run, obviously his hit song, but the title of the autobiography is unbelievable. And maybe it's because I'm a super fan, but I don't think so. I think anybody, even the casual fan or non-musician, might really enjoy it. I mean, he just tells you exactly how he came up, and obviously the industry has changed so much. But if that's not an inspiring journey, I don't know what is. So I've also read Dylan's and Leonard Cohen's, which was a biography. I wish he'd done an autobiography. But that's maybe the best piece of advice I can give. So if my journey was too niche for you, kind of see if your influences have written about themselves or done a podcast like this. Because I feel like artists and all kinds of creatives are really transparent. Some of the business people can be a little bit more, can kind of keep their secrets close to the vest. But creatives are really open, and they'll tell you exactly what they did and how they did it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, it's because even if it's, no matter what it is, it's not one solid formula of how things are. It's like it's you just, and you could try 100 different ways to do whatever it is, and try out what 100 different creatives did to do whatever they went on to do. Maybe a few of those things might work for you. Most probably won't, because we're all wired differently, and how that all comes about is all very different. But it always, like, especially just taking a different perspective on something like that always kind of makes you think like about a new way to do something. It's a kind of a, well, maybe I should try that. Maybe that'll work for me. Like, who knows?
Yeah, and I feel like early on, just knowing that other people were crazy enough to go into music like me was really reassuring, because it can be like so lonesome, and so it just makes it way less scary to know that there are other other folks who are, going for it, because you might not even know anybody in your immediate circles at first who's doing it, um, unless maybe you went to school for it. So at least hearing from people who've done it, that you might not even know, but might be influential to you in your own career and craft is really reassuring. You're not the only one who decided to do this.
We're not the only ones crazy enough.
Exactly.
What is it that you think sets you apart from other independent artists?
It's a good question. I think knowing how to produce has been kind of huge, because if you're not able to produce yourself, um, it might be hard to find somebody who will produce you consistently, especially for free. So it's really hard to be consistent when it comes to putting out music. So you might not have as much control over your timeline. And obviously these days, being consistent is key. And so that might be one thing that sets me apart. There's definitely other independent artists who can self-produce. But less so in kind of more singer-songwriter indie context, because traditionally it's all about the song and maybe one or two instruments, um, and the production comes from somebody else usually. Um, so I think that's been key for my own development.
Yeah, I mean, that is definitely a nice skill set to have because you can already start to execute. So even if you work with somebody to like finalize those ideas, like to have that foundation to kind of really, you know, bring what you hear in your head into whatever you're working with, and actually have those sorts of ideas to execute and, um, send off the idea somewhat polished rather than just like a piano and a vocal and then just have to try and articulate ideas, because oftentimes when you try and articulate what you're trying to hear in the song or what you want a person to do when it comes to music, it's kind of hard to put words to that in a way that are going to translate directly into what you have in your head. And sometimes it can be a happy accident and you could get something better than what you originally had in mind. But other times it's like, no, but I wanted it to be kind of like this. And it's like, well, you didn't really say that, or that didn't really make sense in that way. And so it just also kind of can speed up the process as well, which is very nice.
Totally. And to have a double answer for this question. So producing was really helpful as an independent artist, but also learning how to market yourself, which is not necessarily the most fun part of this whole side of the business, but is super important. I mean, to be honest, you know, I haven't really made any effort to approach labels. I have been able to kind of have enough of an audience over time that I don't really feel inclined to work with labels to the extent that they'll take, a percentage of the songs, if I'm able to find an audience on my own. And, there's something to be said for working with labels. Um, Sometimes they have the potential to really grow a project exponentially. Um, but I haven't found the need. And I have worked with a lot of artists who are signed as a writer producer. And it's not the answer. I think a lot of people are really drawn to the idea of a record deal, and it's, kind of prestigious. And especially it used to be a lot more. But these days, you really can do it all. It's exhausting, but it does get easier over time. It's just like any other set of skills. So learning how to do that and not just getting, followers or kind of empty numbers, but like real listeners and a real audience, really kind of can be a substitute for having, a remote team who may not know you or your music that deeply, because nobody's going to be more invested in your own music than yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there, like a lot of things, there are pluses and minuses to whatever route you choose to take. You know, if you do everything yourself, then you have to do everything yourself. But if you do everything yourself, you also have all the creative control and can really embody who you are in all aspects of what you do. And so, yeah, there are definitely bonuses, but there are also downsides because it's like, it's just which are you going to give up? Like, are you willing to give up like some money and make it less of your problem? Or are you going to put more of your time into it and really like claim it as your own? And that could be said for any of these things, but yeah, it's where things are at. We have the options now. It's not just label or nothing, which is fantastic. It comes with some downsides, but it's more empowering than things have ever been, which is really cool to see. What impact do you ultimately want to have with your music and with your artistry?
Excuse me. I feel like, I mean, I keep coming back to the lyrics, if those stick with people, and, sometimes people reach out and sort of will tell me personal stories of how much this means to them. I think then it'll all have been worth it. That's what we're in this for.
I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's always really cool to see your work impact other people the way that those who inspire you have impacted you. You know, I think there's a lot to be said about what we pour into these songs and how much that can connect with somebody else because you've witnessed it firsthand with whatever music got you here in the first place. Like it's really cool to see how that all, brings itself to life and just you see that something you created has had such an impression on someone else.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's hard to see that because so much of your audience can be virtual, and so I actually don't perform that much in the city. So it's a little faceless sometimes, but it is nice to hear from people, when they do write, because it's so easy to forget that these are real people and they're not just numbers. You are reaching kind of hearts and minds, and at the end of the day, it is a service, to be an artist. And there's only so much of course, it's a very fulfilling process in and of itself, but it does stop being about yourself at some point. And especially hearing the stories from people, it just reminds you of that constantly.
Yeah, 100%. I think that brings us to the final question, which is why music?
Oh, that's so sad. This is the final question. Um, why music? I mean, I think it's just one of those inexplicable things. We're just kind of, I forget who said this, but we're just playing with air. That's kind of what sound waves are. It's just kind of changes in pressure in air, and that's what we're, I don't want to say selling, but that's our product, and it's kind of wild to think about it that way. But I think ever since I was a kid, that was what I was drawn to. And this is a silly example, but sometimes when I play fetch with my dog, she's a lab, you just see it in her eyes. Like that's her purpose, and they're kind of bred for it. But I think everybody has that thing. It gets harder to pursue it as we get older, but I think you always know maybe in her heart of hearts, like what that thing is for you. And if you're lucky to be able to carry it out over time, it's super rewarding and fulfilling. So that's why music for me, it just was one of those things that was a little inexplicable, but very clearly was, call it a passion, that's what it really is. And why music as opposed to other things or other arts, I definitely didn't have the talent, but I also just wasn't drawn to it. It is like this magnetic pull that I think all of us feel at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I am very much an advocate for following that thing that is your purpose, that is your passion, that is the thing to do. And I think you're right. I think everybody has that. And for us to both have the opportunity for it to be music, I think, not to be biased, but I think we're the lucky ones here. Like, to be able to create something so cool and incomparable to anything else is just, and it's something that, like, it's worldwide. It is communal. Like, everybody listens to music. And it's a really cool thing to get to be a part of in whatever way you get to be a part of it. And it's awesome.
Yeah, and also it doesn't even always have to be a career, right? I mean, just doing it for fun on the side as a passion, what have you. I mean, it's that alone is really the point, right? And turning it into a career is not for everybody, first of all, but it can be a blessing and a curse. Anything, when it becomes a job, has all kinds of complicated aspects to it, and sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the core, which is just the process and just really having fun with it. So anybody who just is drawn to it doesn't have to do it professionally, and it can be just as invigorating and at the same level maybe as professionals, but doesn't have to be your professional choice.
Yeah, in whatever way you pursue it, to get to pursue it is, it can take many different forms, like you said. Like, it can be the livelihood, or it can be just something you treat as a hobby, and both are just as well. Whatever role it plays, let it play the role.
Yeah, totally. It's really just, that's the point, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we forget that that's really all that it's about. It doesn't have to be tied to money.
No, it can be, but gets a little dangerous there sometimes.
It's dicey.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of this episode of the Why Music podcast. Check back again next week for another conversation with another independent artist. Thanks for listening.